Welcome to Forsaken by Shadows, a production of stories by Sarah Danielle. In lieu of a clever or witty introduction, we're just gonna go ahead and get right into the story. Last time, on Forsaken by Shadows, from Risman's point of view. Today is going to be the most important day of my life. I can feel it in my bones. Everything I want is happening, or will happen, as soon as I implement my plan. I'm going to tell Mazira I love her. I know it's a risk, and it's not my place as a male to initiate something like this, and the memory of my last attempt still haunts my heart, but I can't keep silent anymore. I need her to know, so I've devised a plan and kept it secret from everyone, including Tiana, who has a nasty habit of telling her father literally everything. I suppose it's nice that they're so close, but some things don't need to be shared. It's not that I don't trust Solarin. He's been more than gracious to Mazira and I over the last year that we've lived in his house. It's just that I know he won't approve of my plans. He's done everything in his power to keep me from being near Mazira, especially when she needs me most. Like last night, when she was screaming in her sleep again. It's not an uncommon occurrence, unfortunately. The dream terrors are supposed to be natural, a phenomenon that should fade over time, but it doesn't make her light-rending shrieks any more bearable. And I'm forbidden from being there for her. Not after today, though. I'm coming into my own, even being commissioned into the militia this very cycle. I have work with a gem cutter and a promising future, and after my garden cavern walk with Mazira, after I give her the amethyst ring I've made for her, I'll have everything. Life has never tasted so sweet. Forsaken by Shadows, Part 3, Where Shadows Linger. Chapter 2, Dream Terrors. Mazira, age 26. Something was burning. Mazira's eyes fluttered open and she bolted up, flinging away the heavy coverlet. Her eyes darted about, looking without seeing, searching in vain for the flicker of orange amidst the cerulean light cascading through the window. Flames. There were flames. There had to be flames. Why couldn't she see the flames? Something was burning. She was burning. Oh no. The words belonged to Tiana, jarring, grounding. Not spoken with the same sense of urgency that pounded through Mazira's heart, but groaned in exasperation. It was enough to cut through the last lingering threads of the dream-induced delirium. Tiana rolled onto her back beside Mazira, rubbing her forehead. Even in the early blue light, fresh from slumber, the girl was unfairly beautiful, as though the hair splayed over her pillow was artfully arranged, strand by strand. She looked up at Mazira with a blank expression and said, "Who do you want to bet it is, Risman or father?" Mazira's heart still raced. Her hands knotted in her shift. She didn't quite grasp the meaning of the question until her mind finally registered what her senses were trying to tell her. There were no flames. Nothing was on fire. She was in her room, in her own bed, and someone was burning breakfast. She let out a long breath and slumped back onto her pillows, feeling like an idiot. That should have been the obvious conclusion. Of course nothing was on fire. Nothing was ever on fire. This was Launa, not Menzo Berenson. She was safe here. I bet it's father. Risman is probably still hiding in his room avoiding chores. Mazira tried to smile, but her blood was still thick with adrenaline, her hands slick with cold sweat. She rolled onto her side, facing the wall, so that the girl wouldn't see the terror lingering in her eyes. But of course, Tiana knew her better than that. They had shared a room for 9 months now, and it seemed half of those cycles ended with Tiana abandoning her own covers to quiet Mazira's blood-curdling screams, like when her mother used to hold her tight, reassuring her that the creaking outside their wagon was just the wind. Except Tiana wasn't her mother. She was a girl 2 years younger than herself, and a drow. Though the longer they lived together, the less Mazira thought of that. Aside from blue lights like this. Mazira shut her eyes. It had been a year. She shouldn't need the songs or the soothing anymore. She should be past this by now. Tiana rolled over. Mazira? Were you dreaming again? Her hand touched down on Mazira's shoulder. The sensation sent a sickly feeling streaking through her skin. Mazira shot up again, scrambling into the corner where the bed met the walls, curling her arms around her knees. Tiana watched her with wide, startled eyes before her look of shock turned to pity. I'm so sorry. Mazira's face flamed and she put her head in her hands. No, I'm sorry. Her eyes stung with tears she didn't shed. I'm fine, really. The mattress creaked as Tiana sat up. I'm going to go check on breakfast. Do you need anything? Mazira shook her head. She kept her eyes hidden in her palms as Tiana slipped out of bed, padded to the wardrobe for a cover, and then disappeared out the door. When she was alone, she let out a huff and grabbed her pillow, hugging it to her chest. What was wrong with her? Tiana was her friend, and a very dear friend at that. Just a few hours ago, Mazira had awoken to the elf's arms around her, holding her tightly against her thrashing and humming one of Elistrea's enchanted melodies, although Tiana herself couldn't actually touch the weave. Elistrea had gifted her with many things, but magic was not one of them. At least, not yet. Still, the song was enough to calm Mazira. She remembered falling back to sleep, comforted by the nearness of the priest's daughter, keeping her safe, chasing her dream terrors away. So why did Tiana's touch make her shudder now? Mazira flumped over, still curled in a ball around her pillow. Tiana's voice rang out in the kitchen, calling for her father. Either he was the culprit of the burned breakfast, or Mazira would soon be receiving a knock on the door from the priest himself, inviting her to join him for a walk. That's usually what happened when her cracks went deeper than Tiana could mend. He might talk with her himself, or he might conveniently cross paths with Saria, or Satara, or one of the many other women who also took an interest in her mental well-being. Not that she resented it. Mazira knew she was incredibly blessed to have so many people care about her. She just wished she wasn't such a burden to them all. Surely this little incident wasn't requiring further intervention. It was just a dream, and a minor panic attack over the burning of breakfast. So stupid, Mazira whispered, flattening out on her back. Her eyes watered again, but she refused to let herself cry. She was tired of crying. It was just a dream, Mazi. Just a dream. They wouldn't really do that to you. But even as she said it, her voice broke and pain lanced across her heart. Images from red light surged forth in her mind, as vivid now as they had been in her sleep. She couldn't recall exactly how the dream started, but she remembered she had been with Rizman. Well, actually, she'd been kissing Rizman, a thought which sent wild flutterings in her stomach. Why her subconscious felt the need to taunt her with such imaginings she couldn't fathom, but it was making it rather awkward to sit across the table from him every meal and look him in the eye. She was fully aware of her feelings for Rizman. She was also aware that he didn't share them with her. Mazira groaned and buried her face in the goose down. Mercy, she'd been kissing Rizman. Their hands entwined, their bodies pressed together in a fervor that she couldn't believe came from her own mind. Dream Rizman had pinned her against the wall, as real Rismond had done on that awful day in the cleric's ritual room. Only this time, Dream Mizira hadn't minded. Real Mizira, however, shuddered, the fluttering making her a little too warm for the heavy blanket she slept under. She tried to bury her face deeper into the pillow, as though she could escape the images. But it only got worse. She remembered the way it felt when her back hit the cold stone wall, and then everything shifted. She was no longer standing, but lying down, flat on her back on a table, like Mindra's operating table, where she lay as a girl and waited for the spiders to crawl over her flesh, knowing it was only a matter of time until one was coaxed to bite. Rismond was still there, but he was different. His hair was long again, and his features hardened in an all-too-familiar way. If it weren't for the crescent scar on his left cheek, she might have thought he was someone else. He straddled her around the middle, trapping her upon the table. He no longer kissed her, no longer held her hands. Instead, his fingers dug into her wrist. It hurt, and she struggled to work her hands free of his grip, but she couldn't escape. Then Tiana was there, looking down at her with disapproval. Now, that color does not suit you at all. She had a needle and thread in her hand, and a bolt of slave-white fabric. Here, let me fix you up. And then Tiana began to sew her a dress, right into the flesh of her skin. Dream Mizira screamed and struggled, but she couldn't escape as Rismond held her down. The needle punched and pulled, up and down, the sting exaggerated by her mounting terror. She remembered crying, begging Dream Rismond to let her go, pleading with Dream Tiana to leave her alone. But on went the needle, with the Dream Tiana protesting that everything was going to be all right. Above her, Dream Rismond laughed, and his laugh, like his face, was that of Teloriel. The door burst open, and Mizira jumped, peering up from her pillow. Tiana bustled in, a sour look on her face. Father burned all the spore bread, she said, marching to the wardrobe. I left it in the oven last night, and he didn't check before rekindling the fire this morning. Then he wandered off to settle the books and didn't even notice. You remember me telling everyone that I'd left the loaves of spore bread in the oven overnight, right? I know I said it. Tiana flung open the doors of the wardrobe and started pulling out her outfit for the day. Mizira took a steadying breath, willing herself to act normal. She sat up and smoothed her hair. If I remember correctly, you said so many times. Yes! Tiana spun and gestured emphatically. Thank you! At least someone around here listens when I talk. She sighed and started to dress. Well, if he wants spore bread, he can borrow it from Goody Amberfane because I am not spending all afternoon in the kitchen kneading dough again. Mizira smiled weakly. Even in her indignation, this Tiana was nothing like the dream Tiana. This was her Tiana, whom she trusted. I can make the bread, she said. I don't mind. Absolutely not, Tiana cried, as she stepped into a forest-colored day dress. It's the principle of the matter. He needs to learn to experience the consequences of his actions. Will you help me with my laces? Normally, Mizira would have obliged at once. Helping Tiana with her laces was almost a daily ritual. But as she stood to join the girl by the wardrobe, she was suddenly lightheaded. Despite what she knew to be true, the thought of going so near to the seamstress sent prickles across her skin, tiny echoes of Dream Tiana's needle. Thankfully, Tiana didn't notice. She was still grumbling about her father's oversight, running a brush through already smooth and perfect hair. Mizira clenched her fists, willing them to stop shaking. Tiana was not like Mindra. Tiana was her dear friend. She crossed the floor and took up the laces, and though her hands defied her wishes, her mind steadied. I'm sure he didn't mean to do it. Oh no, don't you defend him, Tiana said, though she already sounded less annoyed. How can someone so brilliant be so... She waved her brush as she struggled to come up with the word. Oblivious. She sighed. I dread the day when I move on and leave him alone. We're going to find him a wife, Mizira. That made Mizira smile for real. If there was one thing she'd learned about the priest over the last year, it was that there was nothing he desired less than a wife. Fortunately, Tiana didn't often require her verbal participation in a conversation. Well, I'm off to salvage what I can. Do you need help dressing before I go? No, I'm going to wear the blue dress today. Tiana stepped toward the door, then paused, as though the whole of Mizira's statement had needed time to sink in. She turned back and smiled one of her radiant, room-lighting smiles. That's a good choice for today. Then she was gone, and Mizira let out a sigh. She considered flopping back into bed, but she was already at the wardrobe. She might as well get ready for the day. It took her far longer to make herself presentable than Tiana, for Tiana was beautiful without effort. Mizira was not so fortunate. She let her hands trail over the many dresses that had become hers over the last few months, marveling at the collection as she often did. She had tried telling Tiana that she only needed one dress and a spare, but the girl wouldn't hear of it. Mizira had all but replaced Millie as Tiana's dress mannequin, and she had the closet to show for it. But today was a special day, and special days called for her favorite dress. She found the turquoise chiton by the feel of it, the finer weave standing out among the less grand material. The very dress Tiana had presented her with the first blue light she awoke here, 1 year ago. The first thing that was hers, and hers alone since she'd come to the Underdark. As far as Mizira was concerned, it was the most beautiful dress she could ever own. The fabric gathered high around her throat, draping long and loose and completely obscuring the hideous marks Teloriel left on her. A matching sash of fabric cinched it around her waist in a shape she felt was almost flattering. Then again, everything was flattering compared to a slave smock. Mizira owned nothing white anymore, not even a shift, and she suspected that had been by design. The Zovars had done everything in their power to make her new life as different from her old as possible. They hadn't even allowed her or Rizman to help with house chores at first, which had been absolutely dreadful. Mizira didn't know how to exist without work to give her value, which, of course, was the lesson they were supposed to learn. One had a value simply because one lived. Mizira had been taught that as a girl, but it took a few 10 days to remember how to embrace it. Most cycles, she still had to be reminded. Even still, she was glad when Tiana offered to teach her how to spin threads and harvest silkworms. She might not need productivity to have value, but that didn't mean she wanted to spend the rest of her life in idleness. As the light outside gradually brightened, Mizira slipped the blue gown over her head. Then she tied, untied, and retied the sash around her waist until she had just the right silhouette. Or at least, a good enough silhouette. Better than slave smocks, she reminded herself, and the beautiful fabric would make up for the flaws of her shape. Even after a year of being allowed to eat her fill of whatever food she desired, Mizira still thought her body too thin. Once dressed, she closed the wardrobe and perched on the stool of the vanity she and Tiana shared. Carefully, she opened her drawer and removed the ivory comb that Lena and her brothers presented her with shortly after she'd come to Launa. A welcome gift, they had called it, as if risking their lives to find her wasn't enough. Mizira still kept it wrapped in the fine paper they had given it in, marveling that such a beautiful thing could belong to someone like her, especially when she had done nothing to earn it. Tiana had been the one to insist that she couldn't just look at it, that the comb was meant to be used, so Mizira worked the teeth through her curls, picking the strands apart and layering them back where they belonged. A fruitless attempt, really, for in the end she gave up and tied the whole thing back with a ribbon. She would ask Tiana to braid it before they left for the temple, and then it wouldn't matter. Replacing the comb back in its wrappings, she gave her face a long, scrutinizing stare in the mirror. She really did have such sallow skin. Sighing, Mizera collected her palette of brushes and powders. Ivory chalk to add definition and hide the circles blooming under her eyes. Rouge to color her cheeks. Stain to deepen the pigment of her lips, and charcoal to line her lashes. The effect was subtle yet dramatic, and as far as Mizera was concerned, the only way she was fit to be seen. Tiana was beautiful without effort. She was not so fortunate. As she finished her ritual, Mizera beheld her reflection without satisfaction. She did look better this way, but it was hard to know if it was enough. The people of the sanctuary were so kind. She didn't think any of them would tell her if she was unsightly. Not like Teloriel, who had used his brutal honesty as a weapon to wound her. Not for the first time, Mizera wondered what he would think if he saw her now. And as always, the thought sent a racking wave of nausea through her gut. It unnerved her how much she fantasized about him seeing her now and being stunned by her appearance. Not because she wanted his approval, but because she wanted to gloat. She wanted to rub it in his face. She wanted him to see that she could be more than what he made her. You tried to ruin me. But look, I'm not ruined. I'm radiant. But she didn't feel radiant. She didn't even know if she was really beautiful. Risman had said so once. Tiana said so often. Beltel said so the most, but he said as much to every female. She learned quickly not to take his flattery to heart. Though it was nice to be treated like the other girls, even if his attentions were, as his brother put it, less than pure. But to her, who had never before received such attention, the flirtation acted as a sort of medicine for her soul. She mostly repaid the compliments with red-faced stuttering, but that only seemed to amuse the scoundrel more, until eventually Risman or Tiana came to her rescue. The thought of Beltel's antics brought a smile to her face as she turned from the mirror to go clean her teeth in the washroom. But there was no escaping her reflection. There was a mirror there as well, along with an enchanted stone that rained warm water upon command and a clawfoot tub for particularly taxing days. Tiana wasn't wrong when she said her father liked his luxuries. Her smile faded as she caught sight of herself again, and she avoided eye contact with her reflection while she made herself ready. She plucked a mint leaf from the little plant growing in a pot by the washstand, chewing it as her mind mulled over nothing and everything at once. Then another disturbing thought struck her. Would real Risman be as interested in kissing her as Dream Risman was, now that she'd learned to better her appearance? Her face burned. Mercy, these stupid dreams were going to be the death of her. She hurried from the washroom, suddenly craving the company of others to distract her from her thoughts. To her dismay, Risman's door was cracked, meaning she would have to see him soon. She wasn't sure she was composed enough to face Risman yet this morning. But as she stepped into the kitchen, she found only Tiana, wrist deep into a bowl of flour. Would you like help with that? Mizera asked, drifting toward her friend. The fear of the dream terror was fading now that she was up and moving. Tiana had been scowling at her dough, and there were 3 thoroughly charred loaves from this morning on the counter beside her. When Mizera spoke, however, Tiana's expression lightened. Oh no, I'm all right. I'm just making flat rock cakes. They'll be done soon. Mizera nodded, slightly disappointed. She wouldn't have minded pounding the thoughts out of her head. Where are the others? She tried to ask the question as casually as she could, hoping Tiana wouldn't sense the real question lying beneath the surface. Where's Risman? Tiana shrugged. Haven't seen Risman. Father is in the sitting room, as he has been banished from the kitchen. She finished her statement in a shout, glancing over her shoulder with pointed disdain towards the room her father occupied. Solaran's voice wafted back, flat and bland. And I am utterly distressed about it. Tiana rolled her eyes and went back to kneading. Mizera smiled, knowing the rift between father and daughter was trivial at best. She'd been afraid, in the beginning, every time the two would break into bickering. By now, however, she understood that it was just another way they communicated their affection. She left Tiana in the kitchen and went to join Solarin in the sitting room. The priest sat in his preferred armchair, where the light spilled in to illuminate the ink scrawled in the ledger book he held in one hand. As she entered, he glanced up and raised a finger. "Ah, Mizira, my savior. Would you be a dear and bring me my mug of tea, which Tiana will not allow me to return and collect?" "Don't do it!" Tiana hollered. "He needs to suffer!" Mizira hesitated, caught between the wills of her friend and her benefactor, before she remembered who was the master of the house. This wasn't a real fight. It was an elaborate game. If Solarin wasn't in the mood to play along, nothing Tiana said or did would keep him from his own kitchen in his own house. In fact, he probably rather enjoyed sitting back with his numbers, allowing the girls to serve him. He would never admit as much, but he could have very well burned the spore bread on purpose to orchestrate this very outcome. Well, maybe not. Solarin might be shrewd, but he wasn't devious. He was, however, prone to forget small details in the pursuit of what he considered more important work. Mizira crept back into the kitchen and found the stone cup still steaming on the table, full of an earthy liquid. As she reached for it, Tiana whirled about in a flourish of flour. "No!" she wailed, pointing dramatically at her. "Traitor!" Mizira only offered her an apologetic smile. "Sorry?" Tiana deflated with a sigh and waved her on. "Fine, it's fine. I understand. He pays your wages, right?" "I pay yours too," Solarin called. "And provide your food, shelter, and clothing. Gracious, it's almost as if you wouldn't survive without me." "Don't you have temple duty today?" Tiana shot back. "You're late." "That's tomorrow, my heart. Sadly, you're stuck with me." Tiana scoffed, going back to taking out her frustrations on the dough. Mizira's smile gained strength as she brought the tea to Solarin, setting it beside his ledger books. He thanked her without looking up, his eyes roving up and down the page. With nothing better to do than wait for breakfast, Mizira perched on the edge of the settee which rested to the left of Solarin's corner chair. Her eyes trailed to the unoccupied seat to her own left, the one which Risman usually sprawled in when he was present in the sitting room. "He went out before the lightning," Solarin said, as he turned a page. "Something about a project left to cure over red light." Mizira jumped, warmth creeping into her already rouged cheeks. "Oh," she said, feeling foolish. There was no question of who Solarin spoke of. His workshop might fill with apprentices each blue light, but there was only one other who lived in their home. "I wasn't wondering. I was just staring at his chair, like a simpering handmaid, allowing my mind to wander." She sat up a little straighter, feeling the need to appear more formal in the presence of her guardian. Solarin radiated dignity, even when he was teasing his daughter. Mizira wasn't uncomfortable in his presence, but she was never quite relaxed either, as if she needed to appeal to sensibilities higher than her own. Yet for all his astute observation, the priest seemed to be paying her little mind. Did it wander anywhere pleasant? Mizira flushed darker as dreamerism tantalized the edge of her mind. "No," she said quickly, staring pointedly at the empty hearth and carved mantel that took up the entire wall across from her, the only one of its kind Mizira had ever seen in the Underdark, for fire was usually only a tool in these caverns. She'd never seen one lit just for the sheer joy of its ambiance. Then again, even in this hearth, she'd never seen a fire lit. It didn't seem out of place, though. It was just another subtle reminder that Solarin bore a soft spot for frivolous living, no matter what he claimed about his impoverished state. He might have come into the sanctuary with nothing but a babe and the clothes on his back, but Mizira had seen the ledger books. She knew he had made up for lost time. A crease formed between his brows. Well, That is disappointing. He lifted his eyes from his numbers to rest on her face. Unpleasant wanderings, then? Mazira read the concern in his expression and went as cold as she had just been hot. No, nothing of the sort. My mind didn't have time to finish wandering before you asked me your question. His gaze bore into her, and she felt the weaver calculating her words like he calculated the numbers in his books. But whether or not he decided to believe her, he went back to his numbers. Tension knotted her shoulders stiff. I'm so sorry, Mazira said. I didn't mean to worry you. He held up a hand to stop her words. It is my job to worry for you whether you need it or not. He'd said this before, and Mazira knew what was coming next. She almost recited the words with him. It is not something to apologize for, but a role I take great pleasure in. She breathed in deeply, but stopped short of releasing the sigh. Who could actually take pleasure in worrying? As though he sensed her distress, Salaran snapped his ledger shut and reached for another one. What are your lessons this morning? Mazira's tension melted away as the subject changed. Arithmetic and reading, she said. And songcrafting, of course. The lessons alternated daily. Today numbers and words, tomorrow history, which included religion, and the study of how things worked. Everything from life to why larger rocks roll down hills faster than smaller rocks. Things she'd never thought to wonder about. But every day, there was songcrafting. The study of music, art, lyrics, and for Mazira, the study of magic. Salaran nodded in approval, as if he wasn't aware what they were teaching her at the temple despite being the one to enroll her in the school. The classes were a mix of children born in the sanctuary and older students, like herself, who lost the chance to study when they were younger due to the unfortunate turn of their lives. Very good, the priest said. He offered her the thicker of the leather-bound ledgers. Care for a warm-up? I have scripts here that need to be recorded. Of course, Mazira answered, before she actually thought through his request. But it didn't matter. Whatever Salaran asked of her, she would do. She owed him that much and more, and would have done it all for free in exchange for the life he had given her. Yet even now he made note of the light the moment the book was in her hand. He would add these minutes to the rest of her minutes, and pay her 2 silver for every hour she worked at the end of the 10-day. Mazira slid onto the floor and rested the heavy book on a low, rectangular table centered in the room. Salaran didn't bat an eye at her choice of workspace as she settled onto the crimson rug. He merely leaned forward and set a bottle of ink down before her and returned to his own book of accounts. Do not hesitate to ask if you require assistance. Mazira assured him she would, though it wasn't true. She would struggle through the complicated words and large numbers until she figured it out herself. It might take time, but she would do it, because it wasn't natural for a girl her age to struggle through such simple tasks, no matter what anyone told her. In the beginning, when Salaran first invited her to help with the ledgers, he gave her a blank paper to work the figures on, and only after checking behind her work did he allow her to add the debits and credits into his most sacred tome of accounts. It had been frustrating to have him hand the work back to her with a gentle request to try again until she got it right. In a moment of weakness, she allowed herself to complain to Tiana about it, wondering how bad her spinning must be if Salaran would rather her help with numbers when she was so clearly not suited for it. That was when she learned Tiana kept no secrets from her father. The next time she sat across from the priest, with ledgers and ink between them, he saw fit to teach her a new lesson. Spinning is but one skill, he had said, seemingly out of the blue. I can teach you to spin and weave, and then you will be a weaver all your days. But if you learn to keep accounts, you may do more than weave for other artisans. Mazira couldn't fathom what more she could want to do, but she applied herself anyway to the books, and now, as she opened the pages where Salaran had pressed the scripts, she no longer required her work to be checked. She might take twice as long as the priest, but she recorded her numbers directly into the ledger, and he rarely checked behind her work. They fell into silence, aside from the occasional scratching of Mizira's pen and the sound of Tiana in the kitchen. Today was an easy load. Most of the scripts were for profit gained. Adding figures was easier than taking away figures, and Mizira lost herself in the work until Tiana's voice suddenly cut through the din of white noise. "Breakfast is ready," she announced from the door to the kitchen. Mizira startled, spilling a drop of ink onto the page. Frantic, she did her best to smear it away from the letter she had just written. Solarin might not say anything to her about it, but she knew he would scowl when he saw the blotch. The priest didn't even stir. Oh dear, what a conundrum. I've been banished from the kitchen. How will I ever acquire sustenance? Oh, Father, Tiana sighed, her hands going to her hips. Just get in here and eat. And don't you bring that book to the table, But she trailed off, as her eyes fell on the ledger in Solarin's hand. Mizira looked between them, not understanding what about the scene made Tiana lose her words. Solarin seemed to understand, though. He snapped his ledger shut again, springing to his feet. If Mizira didn't know better, she would have sworn he was trying to hide the book from Tiana. She peered at the ledger more closely and noticed, for the first time, that she'd never seen it before. Evidently, Tiana had. "What are you doing?" she asked, a grin spreading across her lips. "Coming in for breakfast," Solarin huffed, dropping the ledger in the chair behind him to hide it from view. "As my lady commands." "No, you're not." Tiana advanced upon him. "Is that what I think it is?" "It's not important." Solarin stood his ground as his daughter stopped in front of him, his arms crossed, his stance rigid. Tiana's face shone with glee. She made a motion as though she were going to dive around him for the book, and Solarin fell for it. He moved to intercept her, but she twisted and went left instead, seizing the book and raising it up triumphantly. "Aha! It is! You're reviewing the fleet ledger!" "Tiana," Solarin growled. He didn't look amused, but his voice hadn't yet taken on that dangerous resonance that signaled when games were over. He reached for the book, but she danced out of his grasp. "It's been 2 years," she continued, ignoring him completely. "What do you know that we don't, Solarin reached for his book again, but Tiana was taller than him. She held it up out of his reach, opening to the page marked with a ribbon. Her look of delight faltered as she beheld it. In her moment of distraction, her father finally managed to snatch the book back, tucking it safely under his arm. "It is not your business what I know, child." "It is my business," Tiana countered. "Because this business is my business." She gestured to the house around them. "Not yet it isn't. I still have time to disown you." The threat carried no barbs, yet the words would have cut Mizira if they had been directed at her. The weaver's daughter, however, didn't even blanch. "You never touch that book unless the fleet is here," she pressed. "But the last entry is dated the day they left. So if they're not here, but you have the accounts, it means you're expecting them." His blank expression was all the confirmation Tiana needed. Her face lit up and she cheered and spun around, twirling her skirts. Her display of joy was so infectious, even Solarin's expression softened, though he didn't smile. "Keep your voice down, child," he said, "and sit before you hurt yourself." Tiana fell back into Rizman's usual chair with wide, innocent eyes. "Please tell us what you know, Baba." For the first time since Tiana had come in, Solarin's eyes flickered to Mizira, as though he had forgotten she was there. His look of surrender turned briefly to concern, but it was too late. He'd already revealed too much to Tiana. She wouldn't let him have peace until he told what he knew. "The knowledge isn't common yet," the priest said, crossing his arms over his chest and giving both girls a significant look. "So don't go making it so." Tiana squealed again. Solarin raised his brow and she stilled, painting innocence on her face once more. "Sorry, go on." The priest looked like he'd rather have burnt spore bread for breakfast. but he relented. Arden Zaren returned to Lana last night. I happened to be at the temple when he arrived, with 3 new voices pledged to join our cause. The fleet is 4 10 days behind them. He held up a silencing hand before Tiana could exclaim again. I'm sure the rumors will be abroad, but Mother Lara will make her official proclamation tonight at the evensong. Do not repeat these words to anyone, and don't go hunting Arden down. He's been away from home for a long time. Give the young man some time to rest. Tiana was now bouncing in her seat, barely able to contain her excitement. 4 10 days! She dove forward and grabbed Mazira's hands. Mazira would have jerked away, but the lounge against her back prevented her from escaping the sudden contact. Tiana didn't seem to notice her discomfort. 4 10 days! Do you realize what this means, Mazira? If the fleet is back in 4 10 days, we could be on the surface by the end of the year! Whatever Tiana had expected the reaction to her statement to be, it was not the silence she received. Mazira gaped at her as the full weight of the news finally sunk in. She had heard of the fleet, of course. After guides, the fleet emissaries were Lana's greatest heroes. Fearless sailors and merchants who traveled a circuit from the Underdark to the Sword Coast, trading in hostile environments, suffering prejudice in the face of their dark elven heritage, endeavoring to spread the message of Elistrea. They would return once every few years, depending on the dangers they encountered. They brought with them gold and surface luxuries, filling the coffers of merchants, such as Solarin, who had invested in the sanctuary's stock. Essential to the economy, most agreed Lana only thrived because of their efforts. But most importantly, after a brief respite, they would return to their circuit, and they would take anyone who wished to go to the surface with them. Tiana wasn't wrong. They could be on the surface in less than a year. But though excitement radiated from her, Mazira was punched with fear. Solarin, for his part, looked as though he had been turned to stone. We? He asked, and his voice found that joy-slicing cadence. He glanced between the two. Have you been making plans behind my back? Tiana's face went ashen. She let Mazira go and turned to her father. No, of course not! Which was true. Although Tiana had peppered her with questions about life on the surface, and often exclaimed her wistfulness to go, they'd never discussed anything remotely close to plans on going. Tiana laughed nervously. I misspoke, that's all. You know how I get carried away. You did not misspeak, Solarin stated, and Mazira sensed the end of all playful banter. You said it because it was in your heart. Rather than bolster her defenses, Tiana deflated. Well, don't act so surprised. I've always wanted to go. You know that. And you know that you're too young, too inexperienced. The surface is too dangerous. Too dangerous? She barked a scornful laugh. We live in the Underdark. I have to be careful about what mushrooms I trip over. It's not the same, Solarin said, straining to remain calm. The surface is full of dangers you cannot comprehend. How would you know when you've never been? Because I listen when the traders talk, he snapped, and I notice who doesn't come home each year. You're not ready for a pilgrimage. I won't allow it. Tiana was on her feet, but her lower lip trembled as her eyes blazed. Solarin remained fixed and immovable, seemingly unfazed by the cut his words had made. For one terrible moment, Mazira thought Tiana would burst into tears. Then her jaw clenched and her fists balled. But you'll let Mazira go? It's not too dangerous for her? Mazira shrank back, shocked at the acid in Tiana's words. It felt like an accusation, but Mazira didn't know what for. She hadn't said or done anything. Why was she in trouble? She wrapped her arms around her knees as Solarin swelled with indignation. Mazira won't be stoned on sight because of the color of her skin. His voice was harder than steel. He glanced at Mizira, and something in her own expression must have struck him because he softened at once. "This isn't a discussion, T, and it is unfair of you to drag your friend into this." He turned away, resting a hand on the mantel, a signal that he was done talking. The taut silence was broken by a knock on the door downstairs, followed by the sound of it opening. A voice called a greeting, and Mizira recognized it as belonging to Lirzin, one of Solarn's apprentices. The spell broke. Tiana spun on her heel and fled into the kitchen. Her footsteps carried down the hall, punctuated by a door slamming. Solarn sighed, his expression empty. He didn't say a word to Mizira, didn't even look at her as he swept into the kitchen. His steps carried him down the stairs, and when he greeted his apprentice, Mizira would never have guessed he had just had a disagreement with his most beloved daughter. Mizira sat still and afraid, wondering what had just happened. Was she in trouble? Had she done something wrong? Carefully, she closed the ledger she'd been working on and sat there, dazed, until she heard more voices arrive downstairs. If the apprentices were arriving, it meant she needed to be leaving. But she'd never walked to the temple alone before. Tiana always walked with her, and Rizman always walked her home. Tentatively, she rose and went to her room. When she peeked inside, she found Tiana on her own bed, sobbing into her pillow. Mizira hesitated, torn between going to comfort her and leaving her in peace. Real fights between father and daughter were uncommon, and Mizira wasn't sure that she wasn't somehow to blame for her distress. She did want to go to Tiana, but she didn't know what to say. She also didn't want to be late for her lessons. "Tiana?" she tried. The girl didn't look up. "Tiana," she said again. "It's getting late. Our lessons." "I'm not going today," Tiana choked out. "Just go on without me. I'm fine." Mizira flinched. She knew the raised voice wasn't directed at her, but it still hurt. Quietly, she slipped the door shut. She would have to walk alone. Tiana was crying, and all she cared about was having to walk alone. What was wrong with her? Mizira twisted her dress in her hands, biting her lip, unsure of what to do. In the end, she resolved to go. It's not like it wasn't safe for her to walk through the city alone, and it had been a year. She shouldn't require hand-holding anymore. It was just a walk. She could do this, and when she came home, Tiana might be ready to talk. Steeling her nerves, she went downstairs. When Solarn saw her without Tiana, he asked no questions. Instead, he suddenly remembered an errand he needed run at the bank, which was conveniently near the temple. The Master Weaver asked Ithior, his youngest apprentice, to do it, and all at once she had company on her walk. Ithior, a half-elf barely older than 16, was all too happy to oblige. His cheerful demeanor and constant chatter were a surprising comfort. By the time she reached the temple, the last of her dream terrors had been chased away. Thank you for listening to this episode of Forsaken by Shadows, written and produced by me, Sarah Danielle. As always, I am most appreciative to Tabletop Audio and Pixabay for providing the music and ambiance that was used in this production. And of course, this story is unofficial fan content not endorsed by Wizards of the Coast. Rizman started the day jubilant and excited, with everything going right. But Mizira's perspective isn't quite so free of shadows. There is much to happen yet before this cycle ends, so subscribe to follow along and find out what happens next.